Howdy everybody and welcome back to the channel and welcome to the first official episode of Platforming, the series where I platform people who have something nice to say about the things they do, whether it be in academics, a profession, or something else. I want to give that person a platform. And today I'm platforming none other than my anthropology professor, Dr. Sarathi. Dr. Sarathi is an archaeological anthropologist with a lot of really cool things to say about the field of anthropology, archaeology, a lot of really cool takes on human culture and how humans operate. It's just very cool with a lot of great content. In this interview, I asked him a lot of broad questions about the field of anthropology, how one may get into anthropology, why it's important, and then some other niche questions which I think are very cool that are worth sticking around for. Now, here's a bit of a warning. Basically, during the filming process of this interview, basically almost everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. During the interview, the primary camera was entirely out of focus the entire time, and the microphones, which we should have been recording on, which you'll see in the video, they're right in front of us, those just didn't pick up, so the audio is coming from a shotgun microphone from across the room. You can still hear us perfectly, you can still see us perfectly, it's just a little blurry and the audio's not as it should be, one could say. This was a very engaging conversation. I got a lot more out of it than honestly I was expecting to, but it's just not quite physically there. Nonetheless, it is still a very cool interview. I got a lot more out of it as the interviewer than I thought I was going to. This was my first time being an interviewer, so I wasn't quite on point. I was still kind of learning the ropes, but nonetheless, it is a very cool video. I hope you stick around for it. In the description below, Dr. Sarathi provided me with some links to check out some projects of his, some profiles of his. So if you want to learn more about Dr. Sarathi, what he does, or reach out to him about anthropology, check the links in the description below. So I will take up no more of your time. Please enjoy the video. Dr. Sarathi, so nice for you to be on here. I've never done an interview before here on the channel. So, it's nice to have you.
I'm honored to be your first interview on the channel, and thank you for interviewing me.
Yeah, it's very exciting. Well, you do a lot of interesting work. So, you're an anthropologist.
Yeah, more specifically an archaeologist.
An archaeologist, okay.
Yeah. In the US, archaeology is a part of anthropology.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So, I feel like anthropology is a little bit underscored a little bit in especially American culture. Oftentimes I myself, I grew up in an area where you don't really think about anthropology a lot. So could you tell us a little bit about anthropology, what goes into it, what people can do in anthropology, and why it's important?
So anthropology is the study of humans everywhere and at all times. And this means that we take a very, very broad definition of what it means to be human. So this doesn't just involve, us as Homo sapiens, but it also involves human ancestors, right, leading up to the rise of Homo sapiens, as well as our primate relatives like monkeys and the great apes. So basically we study humans and what in popular consciousness would be considered human adjacent creatures, right, in order to understand what it means to be human from a holistic perspective. So in the US, we study anthropology from a cultural perspective, that is, looking at what people do in their daily lives, their religion, their language, their driving methods, or, anything can be the grist for the mill of anthropology. We also look at ancient civilizations, which is what I do through archaeology, looking at them through the artifacts and remains they leave behind. Biological anthropology looks at humans as biological beings and at non-human primates as well, again, to try and understand the biological aspect of humanity. And finally, there's a more specialized branch of anthropology called linguistic anthropology, where they focus especially on how language works, how human language works, especially in different cultural contexts. So anthropology is important because in today's world, we are seeing a greater and greater amount of interconnectivity and interdependence, right? The current world situation has underscored to me the extent to which we are dependent on each other, right? Like one country can't make an economic decision without affecting the rest of the planet. And so we need to understand each other in order to make decisions where we can all succeed. Right, and people can actually make good careers as anthropologists, not just as academics, but also in the corporate world, working with a bunch of nonprofits, working with large-scale global organizations like the United Nations and the World Health Organization. The United States government also hires a bunch of anthropologists to fulfill a variety of regulatory obligations that it has. So it does have a moral and I would say a philosophical importance, but also it gives you a lot of practical benefit to be an anthropologist.
That's it's very loaded. I must say, before I took anthropology, before I took introduction to anthropology with you this last spring 2025, I had no idea just how in depth it was. Of course, like from media and from different experiences. Of course, when I heard anthropology, I just thought people just look at people.
Yeah.
But it's definitely far more in depth than that, as you said.
Yeah, but I think people looking at people is actually a pretty nice and succinct way of putting it, actually.
A very simple way of summarizing it.
Yeah, because, when you're looking at someone, you're attempting to understand them, and that's what anthropologists do. We attempt to understand why humans do the things they do, rather than judge the things that humans do, no matter how horrific it may seem to us.
That's a really nice way of putting it, and that's why I'm drawn to anthropology. That's kind of why I wanted to have this interview with you.
Yeah,
is because I think that's very interesting. Because, of course, I grew up in a very rural area here in Texas, and it's very much. I love the people where I came from, but it's very much strictly one culture. One culture. There's not much outside influence, and something new comes in, and it's very much standoffish, kind of judgy a little bit, and I think that's what I like about anthropology, is because it's looking at it in an attempt to understand and not judge, as you said. So it's just an attempt to understand different, because if I learned anything from Intro to Anthropology, it's that, as you said, all humans are anatomically the same, regardless of skin color, of origin, whatever.
Right.
But we're so vastly different. Somebody from Texas, is not the same from a remote Pacific island.
Right, exactly.
So we're so vastly different while also being the same, which is very, very interesting to me.
I think human culture is absolutely fascinating. Like, we know it has to do with the rise of human intelligence evolutionarily, but why humans do the things they do is a question I'm not sure we're able to fully answer yet. Like, humans do bizarre and wonderful and terrible things, and like you pointed out, they do very, very different things in different parts of the planet. I mean, not all of it can be explained by environment alone. So, it's one of the big questions of anthropology, and I would say it's still pretty hotly debated about why people do the things they do.
That's really interesting to hear. We've come so far, and yet we don't know why we do the things we do. It's very interesting.
We can see broad patterns, though. Like, you can tell, that a group of people, a population, would most likely react in a certain way to this sort of stimulus. Keeping in mind that they might not. So there are no laws of human behavior, but you can make generalizations, but keep in mind that the generalizations might not be applicable because of X reason.
Yeah. Gotcha. So you do a lot of work in Zanzibar.
Right.
What do you do as an anthropologist? You're a professor here, but you also do work in Zanzibar. Could you tell us a bit about what you do in regards to that?
Yeah, so I'm an archaeologist, like I said, and I work in Zanzibar, which is a small island archipelago off the coast of Tanzania. I work on the main island, which is also called Zanzibar, and I am trying to understand the connections that this island had with the broader Indian Ocean world. I'm trained as a zooarchaeologist, which means that I work with animal remains found at archaeological sites. So that allows me to reconstruct dietary practice, ancient environments, how humans interacted with animals from a religious perspective, perhaps through sacrifice and so on. But my broader question is to try and understand how these dietary practices, etc., fit into this globalized Indian Ocean world that Zanzibar very much was a part of, starting around 1500 years ago.
Gotcha. Very cool.
Yeah. And I've spent many years in Zanzibar, and I've excavated numerous sites, and we are currently in the process of publishing a lot of our results from those excavations.
Very cool. And this is the part where I reference my notes because I forgot to print out a paper with all my things.
Yeah.
All right, so this is a bit of and I'm going to be reading off of this a little bit because I have a lot of context to add to this question. But so I'm not sure what your experience is, but I kind of mentioned earlier that like my perceptions of anthropology and media have always been kind of like neutral, leaning to negative. But I've sort of seen anthropology looked down upon as a field. It's a culture where I'm from that treats it as if it's like kind of not worth studying, as if we already know what we want to know. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think people are threatened by the idea of studying culture or other cultures? Do you think that people are threatened by different people who do different things? For example, like here in Texas, there's a not insignificant amount of people who do not believe in evolution. You've said that before, where you've taught students here at A&M who have never been taught evolution. They may subscribe to creationist theories or other things, but like, what is your response to that, to those who may think less of anthropology, who may that kind of thing?
Right. I mean, I do attempt to understand them, right? Again, as an anthropologist, I'm trying not to judge these people because they've been brought up in within a particular worldview that makes them value certain things and devalue other things, right? And perhaps for them, it's a matter of a job. You know, many students correctly ask me, what can I do with an anthropology degree? Will I get a good job? So a lot of parents I know are a little bit suspicious of anthropology because they think that their child is not going to get a good job after they graduate with an anthropology degree, right? It could just be a fear of the unknown, like you pointed out. Why should we learn about other cultures when we are sufficient ourselves, if not superior ourselves, right? What I've noticed is that it takes a lot of effort to understand somebody from their own perspective, right? You might be the most open-minded person on the planet, right? And you might be the most progressive, or however you want to define it. But trying to truly understand another culture is difficult. And I think people are afraid of that on some level because that might challenge what they believe to be true, right? If somebody else's system of religion, for instance, works for them, a thoughtful person might ask, why should my religion be the only actual one or the only true one if their system works for them? And a lot of people, perhaps on a subconscious level, are afraid of the knowledge that they might gain from studying other cultures, right? Although it just could be something as simple as xenophobia, like we don't need to study those people because they're just not worth it. So I think a variety of factors go into it, into why anthropology is devalued. And, like you pointed out, there is a popular discourse about anthropology as being this sort of frou-frou discipline, which really contributes nothing to society. And that's because there's a lot of misinformation about what anthropologists do, and the sorts of things they try to contribute to society, mainly based on like movies and all that, right? I think I was watching an episode of Archer where they meet an anthropologist in a South Pacific or a Southeast Asian island, and they make fun of anthropology being a pyramid scheme, right? Where you have anthropologists teaching other anthropologists to be anthropologists. And
the fun fact is that episode of Archer actually was a big part in asking that part of the question.
Yeah, anthropologists love that episode because we've heard that so many times, and the fact that they're talking about it it made us all very happy, even though it wasn't in a positive way. But coming back to something else you pointed out, like evolution, right? That ties into people's deep-seated beliefs about what is and is not real about the universe, right? It's very scary to let go of something that you've been taught over and over and over again is true. And there is no challenging it, because challenging it will change the nature of the universe as you know it. Right? And that's scary for a lot of people. And so a lot of students who come here who have never studied evolution, I'm very gentle with them, as you know. Like, I acknowledge, religious narratives of creation when I'm talking about evolution. And I say that this is part of a broader human enterprise to explain our place in the universe. And if you remembered in our class, rather than explaining evolution, I allowed you to watch a documentary on it and read the textbook on it, and instead focused on misconceptions, right? What misconceptions people have. And to try and show them that it's not the scary thing that's going to turn you atheist, right? It's just a scientific way of understanding the world around you, and it's a scientific way that works, right? And it's a theory, or there are a bunch of theories about evolution that have been supported by evidence over and over again. And that doesn't necessarily make the world less miraculous if it's true, right? In fact, it might make it even more so, depending on your perspective. So that's the perspective I try to impart to my students. Whether I'm successful or not is a completely different issue, because a lot of them come in with very fixed views, and I've had students react in a very hostile manner in assignments and all when I do talk about evolution. So, but I can present the information, I can present my perspective, and then hopefully I've planted a seed that'll take root sometime in the student's mind, and that's the best I can hope for.
Gotcha. So as a professor of anthropology, would you say, and you said you've dealt with students with very fixed beliefs, would you say that you challenge their beliefs, or would you say that you try to add as much context and a broader view to their beliefs?
Well, in American society especially, right, like they've been brought up with the view that either you believe in creation, like more likely than not biblical creation from a Judeo-Christian perspective, or you quote believe in evolution, right? It's an either or. You have to make a choice. But the perspective I suggest to them is that you don't have to make a choice. You can accept scientific evidence without letting go of your religious views. A lot of biologists are extremely religious. I know a bunch of biological anthropologists who study evolution who are devout Catholics, for instance, and they come to a very personal sort of reconciliation between what they believe theologically and what they believe scientifically. And they say that eventually you reach a point where you sort of realize that the universe is a lot more complex than anybody has realized, and we are just grasping with whatever tools we have to try and understand as much of it as possible. So that's what I try to tell the students, that you don't have to abandon your beliefs, and what you believe or don't believe is honestly none of my business. I'm trying to make you scientifically literate, but at the same time, I want you to remember that this does not challenge your beliefs necessarily. It should just make you think more deeply about the universe and its nature.
I really like that answer. That's a very nice answer, especially considering, obviously you're about to move over to the United Arab Emirates at the University of...
the American University of Sharjah.
American University of Sharjah, gotcha.
Yeah.
But especially here in Texas, as you said, there's a lot of... It's very biblical. A lot of people subscribe to Christian values here, especially here at Texas A&M, a very more conservative state, very much traditional in that aspect. So I think that's a fantastic way of, at least from my perspective, that's a fantastic way as someone who was brought up in a town like that, very traditional, very, very Christian.
Yeah.
That's a great way of coming across. It's I know it's worked on me. It's made me think. I've never been a very religious person, but it's definitely I've enjoyed what you have said about things, and especially beliefs and whatnot. I do really appreciate that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. That does make me very, very grateful to hear that. But in different cultures, you have different ways of approaching evolution, right? I think I told you students in class that I went to a private Christian school in India, even though I wasn't Christian, right? And my biology teacher, I remember in sixth grade, would be teaching us about evolution in one class, and she was also the scripture teacher, Mrs. Jacob, and she would teach us scripture, Genesis, in the other class. And there was never this idea that we need to somehow talk about why we're talking about these different narratives. There was almost this very sort of tacit sort of reconciliation that these are different ways of understanding the universe, and they don't need to fight. In Africa, which has become Christianized, especially recently, and Africa has a lot of evolutionary evidence. I was just asking some of my friends there who are very devout Christians, do you think that, you're working on these fossils, these hominin fossils that are like a couple of million years old? Do you think the challenges was what your pastor says? Because I've heard your pastor say that the world is 6,000 years old. And he said, no, it doesn't. I just see these people as my ancestors. So they see the fossil remains that we are finding as their ancestors. And they've sort of found a way to make room for that in their worldview.
This is another question that I wanted to ask you that I think is one that I personally want to know, at least your opinion on. So in the intro to anthropology class that I took with you, you had mentioned that there are arguments out there in the field of anthropology to completely restart the study, the field, due to the not so good roots of anthropology.
Yeah.
Where it has a lot to do with colonialism, where a lot of quote unquote bad things happen, to summarize it very lightly.
Yeah.
So what is your response to that, especially since you had brought it up in class?
Right. And what you're referring to are the colonial and racist and sexist roots of anthropology, right? Where anthropologists, as the discipline developed in the 19th century, were more focused on classifying humans and trying to understand, quote, primitive societies, right? To put it simplistically. And very often with an agenda, right? Like, we need to save these people from themselves. We need to, quote, civilize them and Christianize them, because otherwise they're just barbarians and savages and children. Basically, they're like children who need to be educated by us because we're so much superior. And one thing I always point out is that Joseph Mengele, the infamous Nazi doctor, scientist, had a PhD in anthropology, and you can still read his dissertation online. So anthropology has a very troubled past, as do many disciplines. A lot of people recently have argued for just restarting or rebooting anthropology. A couple of years ago, in fact, there was a paper called Burning Anthropology to the Ground, right? Like, just getting rid of, I don't know if I'm doing justice to the paper, but basically, evaluating everything that works and doesn't work in anthropology, and then having a culling, as brutal a culling as possible, to actually create a discipline that works, right? And a lot of people have pointed out that even if anthropology doesn't explicitly subscribe to the idea of race, we don't, as we talked about in class, we explicitly say it's not real, the idea of race. There are still racial and racist practices within anthropology, right? Like, the discipline is overwhelmingly still dominated by white men, right? Like, why does that have to be the case when the population is much more diverse, right? And a lot of people have pointed out that if you are a woman or you're a minority, you're probably going to be put in a diversity committee, or you're viewed as a diversity hire rather than as someone who's been hired on their own merits. So they say that, there's still a lot of racist practices that go on within anthropology that aren't talked about, because to a certain extent we're so smug about ourselves, about how not racist we are and how we reject racism in all its forms. And they say that we aren't being self-critical enough. So my view is, yes, we do need to be self-critical, right? Especially in American anthropology, because American anthropologists wield so much influence over how the rest of the world thinks about anthropology. We do need to be representative, right? Not just of like different ethnicities and identities, but of different perspectives. I think that's where true diversity within a discipline comes from, is, realizing that a person's background and identity gives them a different way of looking at things. And that, that diversity of opinion creates this sort of intellectual fertility that allows the discipline to grow. Sort of like having, a population that's genetically the same, eventually you're going to end up with like the Habsburg chin. But if you have a lot of diversity within your gene pool, you're going to have the ability to survive, diseases, and you're going to create a much healthier population, in a very simplistic analogy that I can think of. Yeah.
Gotcha. So you believe that there are still, obviously the field of anthropology has come a long way.
Yeah.
Very obviously, it's not the same as it was when it began.
Yeah.
But do you think that all those negative, like you said, the racist, the sexist, the colonialists actions, the very bad actions of the early anthropologists, do you think they bleed into what anthropology is now, like to a negative extent? Or like, do you think that that it's so far in the, I guess I'm trying to think of how I want to phrase this, or do you think it's so far in the past for the field that it's sort of, it happened, but anthropologists look back on it and say, we know that was wrong and we're going to grow from that.
Right. I see what you're saying. Like, for instance, medicine is more than 3,000 years old. And, talking about what some system of doctors did in Egypt, like, in 2500 BCE or whatever, how, whether we should be challenging that all seems irrelevant at this point. Right. But anthropology is less than 200 years old, I would argue, or just over 200 years old. So we do have the potential for a lot of bleed through. Right. One of the basic examples that I can think of is that these early anthropologists were very concerned about classifying societies. So you see some classification systems that are simple, that are basically, civilized, barbarian, savage, and something else. Like, they would actually use these terms. And then we got a little more polite with it and we started calling them bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. And then a lot of people, including me, are pointing out that, if anthropology is all about human diversity, then classification systems sort of break down because classification involves a certain level of uniformity, right? It requires a certain level of uniformity that human societies might not be able to provide. So that is the biggest instance that I can think of intellectual bleed through. In terms of bleed through in practice, like I said, the discipline until very recently was dominated by white men. Now you have a lot more women in the profession, but it doesn't really represent the American population if you're talking about American anthropology. So there are still issues that link to what's happened in the past that we need to address.
So my next question for you is, and I've asked this before during office hours, and I really liked your answer, so I wanted to ask you it again. So I'm a history major. I study history. I'm really interested in anthropology. I think it's really cool, but history's more of my thing. That's what I want to do. But through the intro class, obviously anthropology is the study of human culture, what humans have done. It's the study of humans. And history is, of course, it's history. It's like, what have we done throughout history? And I've noticed that there's a lot of overlap between the two, between history and anthropology, but at the same time, they are vastly different. And like I said, I've asked you this before, but where would you draw the line, if there is one, between anthropology, like the study of anthropology, and the study of history?
Right. I don't remember what my answer to you was, but I'm hoping it's going to be the same now. But I honestly don't see that much of a difference. I think that they're just approaching the issue from different perspectives, right? Historians attempt to understand the past through written sources, whereas anthropologists attempt to understand the human experience as a whole. And those anthropologists who deal with the past, like archaeologists, primarily use material remains. Right. I think I told you this. I have a bachelor's in history, and I actually quit history for archaeology because I felt a little bit limited. I felt that, focusing almost exclusively on written sources and perhaps oral stories was doing human culture a disservice because we were ignoring so many other lines of evidence. When I came to anthropology, I found a much more welcoming home where I could cross disciplinary boundaries. So they were fine with me using historical sources to do my archaeological work. In fact, there's a whole branch of archaeology called historical archaeology. I think that historians and archaeologists and anthropologists all have the same enterprise. We just look at things from a very, very different perspective. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just depends on what really appeals to you as a person and how you can intellectually justify the narratives that you are writing as a scholar based on what evidence you decide to use or not to use.
Gotcha. You had mentioned that actually was very similar to what you had answered last time. But you had mentioned last time that I believe you had written a paper on trade routes, if I remember correctly, and you felt limited to what you could use in regards to you writing about trade routes through history versus from an anthropological perspective, you were able to utilize more evidence to support that.
Yeah, so that was for my honors senior thesis as an undergrad, and I was writing about Indian Ocean trade routes, and most of the sources that are available are Greco-Roman sources, right? You do have some Persian and Indian sources and some Chinese sources, but that's about it. And the Greco-Roman sources are biased in their own way, and all the other sources are biased in their own way. That they might be talking about trade in a very ancillary way, and there was this idea until fairly recently that. Once the Greeks and the Romans got into the Indian Ocean world, that's when the trade really took off. And once the Roman Empire collapsed, the trade sort of collapsed again, and it didn't take off until the Muslim conquest. The archaeological evidence didn't suggest that at all. The archaeological evidence shows very clearly that the Indian Ocean trade networks have been gangbusting since like 5,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago, if not earlier. And they continued after the collapse of the Roman Empire and through various historical events. And I felt stifled that the archaeological evidence that I was using was not given as much credence by the historians I was working with than the historical evidence. It was almost as though the material evidence sort of took backseat to the historical evidence, and I really found that weird. Like I wondered why we just aren't using all the evidence that we have available to us, written and material, in order to understand these trade networks to get a much fuller picture of what's actually happening. So that was my big event that sort of made me question my allegiance to history. But I know things have improved now. I know that historians have gotten better at using material evidence, archaeological evidence, and I know that archaeologists have become a lot better about using historical sources in a more thoughtful way as well. So I think now the situation is a lot better than it was when I was an undergrad. So I'm hoping things continue that way.
Gotcha. Yeah, a lot of, and obviously I'm just a junior right now, undergrad, but in my experience in my history classes, I have seen a lot of instances where we are using material evidence, where we are saying, hey, we're studying, Algeria, and we have this piece of physical evidence from there. That means, and we draw conclusions based on what we can find. Do you see I guess, a future where anthropology and history sort of come together, like as studies?
I would like to see that future because honestly, I don't see a disciplinary difference between them. I think they developed in parallel, and I think it would be great if we could have a combined history anthropology department, right, where we look at the same question, for instance, from multiple perspectives. So I think it's great that your teachers now are actually using material evidence, but even 10, 15 years ago, like African history started when the Romans, it started with the Egyptians, then nothing else was happening in Africa apparently. And then the Romans showed up and suddenly history arrives. And you had historians in the 1960s literally saying that the African past is one of darkness until Europeans show up or something like that. And, so history has been used in a very bigoted way to not allow people to have history, if that makes sense. Arguing that certain people have history and certain people don't, which really, really bothered me. I work in Africa, and telling my colleagues, oh, you just don't have history until the Europeans or the Arabs show up. That sounds like fighting words to me.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Certainly agree with that. Well, that is really nice to hear, because I think it's the more time I spent talking to you about anthropology, it's studying humans, and there's history where we're studying, the texts and what has been recorded, kind of thing. So that's one thing that has kind of, especially over the course of 2025, since taking your class, is that it's just been, I've seen so much overlap where there's so much overlap, but there's not overlap simultaneously. And I've wondered, like, many times, like, well, if I'm taking history, shouldn't I be required to take anthropology classes? Or if I was an anthropology major, shouldn't I be required to take history classes? I don't know what anthropology degrees look like. I don't know what the degree planner looks like, but I feel like they just go hand in hand to an extent where it's like, if I'm studying one, I feel like I have to understand the other, which kind of, it makes sense.
I think that's absolutely right, especially if you're doing archaeology, right? If you have written sources for a particular culture, why wouldn't you use them? Just like if you have artistic evidence for a particular culture and you have written sources, why wouldn't you use everything? So I think what you're saying absolutely makes sense. I think we need to come together as disciplines a lot more than we have in order to create a more full narrative of what people did in the past and in the present. But people are very invested in disciplinary boundaries, and they might not be comfortable crossing the aisle, as it were.
This video has become a call to action.
Yeah.
But I guess we'll have to see how that plays out in the future. How the studies, I guess, develop.
Yeah.
Especially going into the digital age where everybody can see everything.
Yeah. And also, I want you to remember that different lines of evidence come with different systems of analysis and different considerations, right? Like if you're reading a written text, maybe some guy's narrative of a campaign, you need to have training in how to look for biases and how to look for what he's not saying, for instance. So textual analysis is its own thing. So to a certain extent, the disciplinary boundaries make sense because different lines of evidence require different training, but at the same time, there's no reason why we can't work together.
Absolutely. As someone who is not a professional, I agree.
Yeah.
So my next question is, what do you think are the best parts and the worst parts about working in the field of anthropology, in your opinion?
I think the best parts are, the ability to teach students and do research on a subject that you're passionate about. It's a very profound thing to realize that you are actually contributing to the narrative, to the knowledge that people have about a subject. So you're not just reading and consuming the story of the past, you're actually contributing to it. And I think that's the most exciting part of being an anthropologist or an archaeologist for me. And sharing my excitement with students, it comes with its own joys. There's nothing like teaching a class. If you ever become a teacher, you'll know what I mean. If there's a class that's engaged and you can tell people are paying attention and they're asking questions, and they might not understand fully what you're saying, but they're just so interested and eager, like there's really nothing like that feeling. So I think those are the two best aspects of working as an archaeologist or an anthropologist and an academic. I think the worst aspect sometimes would be the bureaucracy that you sometimes have to deal with in order to do your research, right? Because sometimes, like with me, my research is in a completely different country, and so they have their own rules and regulations, and sometimes it takes months of preparation before you can actually go and do a 2-week dig or something like that. So I think that would be the most tedious part of being an archaeologist, but in the end, it's worth it, right? I think it was an archaeologist called Kent Flannery who said that archaeology is the most fun you can have with your pants on. So it's a wonderful field, actually. Like, I wouldn't trade it for anything. I mean, yeah, there are days in the field where I've woken up with dysentery and just wanted to die, but the thought of abandoning what I do just never occurred to me.
That's a really nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
I like that. That's another reason why I wanted to have you on, is that like it's just you are passionate about the field, and that's very nice to hear.
Yeah.
Because you are open-minded about different beliefs, and you do welcome things. So that's really nice, and yeah, that it's nice to know it's worth it. I guess is what I'm trying to say. It is nice to know it's worth it.
If you find something you're passionate about and you follow it, I think honestly, there's nothing better in life than that. It's so fulfilling that, like, almost every other consideration falls away almost.
I like that. And I suppose my last big question for you is that, say someone wants to study anthropology. Someone's interested. Someone has watched this video and they say, "I want to be an anthropologist."
Yeah.
Where do they go from there? What does studying anthropology look like? What did jobs in anthropology look like? Like you said earlier, a lot of companies are hiring anthropologists. What does the journey of becoming an anthropologist look like to someone who may want to or be interested in it?
Right. Well, it starts off with sometimes you have anthropology classes even in high school, but anybody who's interested, whether they are a college student or not, I would recommend reaching out to an anthropologist at a university. Right. If they are a student at a university, they can speak to somebody in the anthropology department and ask what they need to do in order to either get a bachelor's or a higher degree in anthropology. That would be the way to go, because speaking to somebody in the field about your interests, specific interests, would be the first place to start, because then they would be able to give you advice on how to get started and what to do and so on. Like if any of your viewers want to reach out to me, you're free to share my email with them, and I'd be happy to talk to them about it, because I'm always eager for people to come into the field and contribute different perspectives. In terms of careers, it gets a little bit tricky there. A bachelor's degree in anthropology is a good foundation for other graduate degrees. So, for instance, if you have a bachelor's in anthropology, you can go into medicine or law with a much better understanding of human nature, or management, right? Something that gives you an understanding of human nature, that requires you to understand humans. Anthropology is a great basis for that. If you want to get a graduate degree in anthropology, your options are probably going to be in academia, or in a nonprofit, or in primarily, right? And then we'll come to corporations in a second. So academia is the route I took, where you get your PhD and then you become a professor somewhere and you continue your research and your teaching. If you do end up getting a master's or a PhD in anthropology or archaeology, you have a bunch of agencies who are hiring. So in America, you have cultural resource management companies. So by law, on US public land, and I'm not sure if it differs from state to state. I think federally it's definitely the case, but states might have different laws. When construction or road building takes place, you are required to do a cultural resource assessment to see if anything's going to be destroyed by that construction. And archaeologists are brought in, and very often they do a quick survey and an excavation of whatever they can, and save what they can and record what was there before the construction takes place. And there are a ton of careers to be made in these CRM firms, who usually have contracts with the federal or state government. Other than that, you have international agencies, like I said, like the United Nations and WHO and UNESCO and various other organizations, who hire people who are specialists in human culture. You just have to go and see their job boards, right? And you can see their different postings, and a lot of them are, with expertise in Sudanese culture or something, to be deployed to Darfur, and you will probably end up in a conflict zone, but that's the nature of things. More recently, corporations have started hiring anthropologists within HR departments, because they are very interested in understanding, first of all, how to market their products, especially if they're retail oriented, to different consumers in different parts of the planet, to try and make their product makes sense elsewhere, which is why McDonald's has done well internationally, because they have managed to adapt locally. So I think as we go forward, what you're going to see is an expansion of opportunities for anthropologists, but a lot of it depends on how you leverage yourself, right? If your anthropology degree gives you the ability to study human culture or understand human culture, you can use that understanding and argue that it gives you, it makes you suitable for a variety of jobs. So I know people who have masters in cultural anthropology who went on to become part of the US Foreign Service, right? They're diplomats now. They become public administrators, they become school teachers. So any sort of profession that requires you to understand humans, you can legitimately make a case that your degree in anthropology will help you do that job better.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Yeah, maybe someone who's interested in anthropology will see that, and they'll know that there's more than just let's watch people.
Yeah. I mean, people watching is like the fundamental part of anthropology, but the understanding that comes with it, understanding why people do the things they do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that can be applied in a variety of professions.
I've definitely learned, and I'm saying all this after I just took one intro to anthropology class, but it's definitely made an impact on me, I would say. Like your class has definitely made an impact on me, and starting in July, going to study anthropology of death.
Mm-hmm.
And so that'll be very interesting, how different cultures and different people react to death and those sort of things. So it's been very interesting to learn, not necessarily learning about the people themselves, but learning how to learn about the people,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. That's been really cool for me, because before this, I've always had, like, before I took this class, the intro class, I've very much been, why would we here judge people who are on the other side of the world?
Yeah.
Because we're not them. We
Yeah,
don't
exactly.
understand them. Like, why on earth would we judge them? We're not in their shoes.
Right.
I've always had that mindset. I see people who may be racist or xenophobic or like whatever the case may be,
Mhm.
and I think, why is that? Like,
Yeah.
you're not in their shoes, and you fundamentally don't understand them. Why even bother? Like, why bother to judge when you don't understand? That's always been my thought, and of course, speaking with you and learning from you has definitely been a breath of fresh air on that
Yeah, I'm
front,
glad
to
to
know
hear
that
that. Yeah.
there's actually something dedicated to the understanding of people.
Yeah, and remember that understanding doesn't mean agreeing with them or accepting what they do, right? You can understand the Nazis, but you don't have to accept what they did as right.
Absolutely.
So understanding is very different from accepting or agreeing with what someone says or does or believes. So that is an important thing to keep in mind. And another thing in terms of career I completely forgot to mention is I've noticed a lot of graduates, undergrads and grads, have started going into UI and UX jobs, because if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Like, how users interface with different applications is a fundamental part of understanding how humans behave. So their training allows them to be very effective in those jobs.
You said UR, UX?
UI, so user interface and user experience.
Okay, gotcha. Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha.
And coming back to what you were saying about people being xenophobic or whatever, I think it's built into being human. Like, I don't think I've found a single human society where there isn't some sort of us versus them mentality. Sometimes they might be very, very neutral about, okay, we're just us and they're them, but sometimes it can be very negative. It seems to be a fundamental aspect of being human. Possibly has to do with our evolutionary roots, where we try to make our group survive over other groups, and we've just sort of stuck with it and not questioned it as much as we should have. And it's easy, it's easy to judge people because it gives you a sense of superiority. It gives you satisfaction that you're not like them in many ways, that you're doing the right thing and they're doing the wrong thing. And overcoming those tendencies takes a lot of intellectual and emotional work, and I'm not sure a lot of people are okay doing that.
So that kind of branches back to one of the first questions I asked, where it's very much a topic of people are sort of scared to see other cultures. They're sort of scared to, because it may threaten what their understanding of life in the universe is.
Yeah.
So that kind of ties back right into that.
Yeah, and adding to that, I would also say that, you see me, I'm in my office, I'm in a comfortable chair, but we've talked about cultural relativism in class, right? About how you try to understand a people or a culture from their own perspective. That's not easy. And it takes a lot of emotional energy. And I know a lot of anthropologists sometimes end up outright in mental institutions, or they end up having a lot of emotional and mental issues that they need to sort through. Because sometimes you see humans doing horrible, horrible things to each other and to animals and the environment and so on, and you don't know how to handle it emotionally, because as an anthropologist you're not supposed to judge, you're supposed to understand, but as a human you do. So it's not for the faint of heart. People don't realize that as a social scientist, right, whether you're an anthropologist or a historian or whatever, or a sociologist, you sort of lose the luxury of judging people. And I think that's a luxury that people take for granted. And they don't realize how much that plays a role in our own sense of self-stability. And, being so relativistic, where you say, okay, oh my God, they just killed somebody, but they had a cultural reason to do it, I don't accept it. It can cause a lot of emotional and mental anguish. So it's not for the faint of heart.
So a lot of the study requires you to look past your own human tendencies.
Yeah, not ignore them, but try and keep them out of your analysis or understanding of what other people do. Because, like I say, you're human too. You are allowed to have your feelings and your prejudices, and you are allowed to find certain practices repulsive. You are allowed to find certain religions wrong or whatever, right? But as an anthropologist, you don't let that affect your work. That's the point. It's not to tell you not to have biases. I think that would be silly, given that we're human and it's sort of like part of our hardwiring, but anthropology sort of transcending that.
Understood.
Yeah.
Wow. That's about all the questions I have for you.
Okay.
My next, questions regarding actual answers. But my next thing is, can we look at that you have back there?
Yeah.
Your Aztec obsidian sword.
Yeah. So in Finland, when you get a PhD, you get a top hat and a sword, and in America you don't, and I think that's a damn tragedy. And so I decided that I want a sword because I got a PhD and I deserve it. So I wanted to get something very unique. So I got this, it's called a mahua and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. But it's basically the fundamental weapon used by the Aztec eagle and jaguar warriors, if I'm not mistaken. And it's basically a flat club that's lined with obsidian blades. And obsidian is volcanic glass, so it's chipped and it cuts better than surgical steel. And the Spanish talk about the Aztecs using it to chop off the heads of horses, and the more the obsidian breaks, the sharper it gets. And eventually, if you've run out of obsidian, you still have a club. Right, mm-hmm. And this is a very unique weapon. It's very interesting that different cultures across the planet have come up with different kinds of sword-like implements. So in the Pacific, for instance, you have a similar wooden thing but lined with shark teeth, right? So you have shark-tooth swords. So people come up with...
That's really cool.
Yeah. So this is my gift to myself for getting my PhD. Yeah.
That's a pretty fantastic gift, and it's all real obsidian too.
Yeah.
It's all that's fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, this is not an actual Aztec artifact. This is a reproduction, but yeah this is actual obsidian.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've got myself on it once or twice. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Nice. So it really works.
It really works. Yeah.
It really works. I remember one of the first times I came into office hours with you, and I said I think I had to run to a class or something. I was running late, and I said that I'd be back, and you had mentioned, oh yeah, next time you come, I'll show you my obsidian Aztec sword. I remember I stopped as I was about to go out the door, and I was like, the what now?
Yeah, it's definitely something that gets students very excited. Yeah.
It's very cool, that's for sure. It's very cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this I think that everyone who gets a PhD deserves a sword.
I would definitely get a PhD to get a sword.
Yeah. Even if you have to buy one yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That way it's justified.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's about all I have.
Okay.
I think I got everything I wanted to get accomplished today. Thank you for your time. It has been fantastic.
Well, thank you for interviewing me. I really enjoyed this conversation with you.
Yeah, and hopefully, cameras and recording and everything actually turns out good. Yeah. Hopefully, I didn't mess anything up. So hopefully, this will be a really cool video. I'm very excited to see how this is going to turn out.
I'm excited too. I'm excited to see the final product.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
It has been a pleasure.
Yeah.
And,
Awesome. Thanks.
Any closing remarks? Anything you want to add to that?
All I would say, I mean, I know it sounds a little bit trite, but given the state of the world as it is now, I think, a discipline that focuses on human understanding is more relevant than ever. And not simply because it can create peace or harmony or whatever, but at the very least, it allows you to make good decisions about other people that you might not make otherwise.
Understood.
Because understanding somebody sort of reduces your risk of underestimating them and making the wrong decision in any particular political or military situation, at the very least, if you want to think about it from a strategic perspective. So that's all I would say.
Got it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that.
Of course.
Thank you for that. And thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Hopefully I'll have many more interview-like videos to come of this, whether it be academics or other professions. But regardless, hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you later. Goodbye.
Bye. Awesome.
Thank you so much.
That was wonderful. I really enjoyed it.
That was awesome.
Yeah.